It was 3 days before Christmas, and I was driving back to my family's cabin in Montana. The snowstorm had been raging since midday, and the highways were nearly deserted. I had underestimated how quickly the weather could turn, and now I was crawling along an unlit back road with barely any visibility. The forest pressed close on either side, its snow-laden branches bending under the weight of the storm. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of my windshield wipers and the occasional gust of wind battering the car. My phone had lost signal hours ago, leaving me utterly alone in the white expanse. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure on the side of the road. A man stood there, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, his hand raised in an awkward attempt to flag me down. My stomach tightened. I wasn't the type to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere during a storm, but something about the way he stood there, hunched against the cold, made me hesitate. I slowed the car and rolled down the window slightly, letting the freezing air rush in. "Are you all right?" I called out, my voice trembling more from unease than the cold. The man stepped closer, his face partially obscured by the scarf and hood. "My car broke down," he said, his voice muffled but calm. "I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" I hesitated, glancing at the empty passenger seat. Leaving him out here felt wrong, but the thought of being alone with a stranger made me uneasy. After a moment, I nodded. "All right, get in." He climbed into the car, brushing snow off his coat and muttering a soft, "Thank you." The air immediately felt heavier. His presence filled the small cabin, the scent of damp wool and winter air clinging to him. I couldn't see much of his face beneath the scarf and hood, but his eyes, sharp and dark, flicked around the car as if taking inventory. We drove in silence for a while, the tires crunching through the snow. I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, trying to gauge his intentions. "Where's your car?" I asked, finally breaking the tension. "Back there," he said, gesturing vaguely behind us. "Ran out of gas." Something about his answer felt off. I hadn't seen any signs of a car on the road, no tire tracks, no hazard lights. But before I could press further, he leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "You missed the turn," he said abruptly. "Take the next left." I frowned. "What turn? There's no road there." "It's a shortcut," he replied, his tone insistent. "Trust me, it'll save time." A cold dread crept over me. I tightened my grip on the wheel, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. "I think I'll stick to the main road," I said firmly. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable beneath the scarf. "Suit yourself." The silence between us grew unbearable, the storm outside somehow less oppressive than the tension inside the car. I wanted nothing more than to reach the nearest town and end this unsettling ride. As we continued, the road became narrower, the trees closing in like a tunnel. The storm had picked up, and the visibility was worse than ever. That's when I noticed something strange. The man was no longer looking out the windshield. His gaze was fixed on me, unblinking. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I hesitated. "Kate," I lied, hoping to deflect his attention. He chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "Lying doesn't suit you, you know?" My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the car's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, and the vehicle came to an abrupt stop. I cursed under my breath, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The man sighed, his breath fogging the air. "Well, this is inconvenient," he said, his tone almost amused. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was still no signal. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the trees. "Stay here," I said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove box. "I'll check under the hood." The man didn't protest, but his gaze followed me as I stepped out into the snow. I popped the hood and shone the flashlight over the engine, though I had no idea what I was looking for. The storm whipped around me, biting through my coat and numbing my fingers. When I returned to the car, the passenger seat was empty. Panic set in as I scanned the road and the woods beyond. The storm had erased any tracks he might have left, and there was no sign of him anywhere. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel tightly. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared into the darkness, half expecting him to reappear. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, the storm began to ease, and the faint glow of dawn broke through the trees. I mustered the courage to step out again, determined to figure out where I was. That's when I saw it. Written in the snow, just beyond the car, were the words, "Next time, take the turn." I never found out who the man was or what he wanted. The car eventually started, and I drove straight to the nearest town without stopping. But the memory of his dark eyes and the ominous message in the snow haunts me every winter. Every time I drive through a storm now, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to pass him by. It was late January, the heart of winter, when I decided to visit my grandparents at their rural farmhouse in Wyoming. The landscape was frozen in time, with fields stretching endlessly under a blanket of snow and the forest looming darkly at the edges. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you feel utterly alone in the vast emptiness of the countryside. I hadn't been to the farmhouse in years, but I remembered the solitude well. It was the kind of place where silence had a weight, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind through the trees or the distant howl of coyotes at night. My grandparents loved the quiet, but for me, the isolation had always been unsettling. This visit was meant to be a peaceful escape from the stress of my life in the city. I planned to relax, help out around the house, and maybe take a few long walks in the snow-covered fields. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. It wasn't just the biting cold or the gray, oppressive sky. It was the feeling that the fields were watching me. That afternoon, I bundled up in my heaviest coat and boots and decided to take a walk. The air was still, the kind of quiet that made every crunch of snow underfoot sound deafening. I wandered toward the edge of the property, where the open field met the dense pine forest. It was a place I'd played as a child, imagining all kinds of adventures between the trees. As I reached the middle of the field, I saw it, a snowman. It stood tall and alone, its 3 stacked spheres of snow perfectly rounded, with stick arms jutting out at odd angles and a crooked smile carved into its face. I stopped, staring at it. No one in my family had mentioned building a snowman, and the farmhouse was too isolated for it to be the work of a passing stranger. It stood there like a sentinel, watching over the empty field, its lifeless grin seeming out of place in the desolation. The snowman gave me an odd sense of unease, but I brushed it off. Maybe it had been there for a while, built before the most recent snowfall. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed it when I arrived. That night, as the wind howled outside the farmhouse, rattling the windows and whistling through the eaves, I couldn't stop thinking about the snowman. There was something unnatural about the way it stood there, perfectly still yet somehow alive in the swirling snow. Before bed, I glanced out the window. The snowman was still there, standing exactly where I'd seen it, its crooked smile faintly visible in the moonlight. I pulled the curtains shut and told myself to forget about it. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside my window. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but as I lay there listening, I realized it was a soft tapping, deliberate, rhythmic. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the storm. The tapping came again, louder this time, as though someone or something was knocking at the glass. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and crept to the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow behind them, distorted by the frost on the glass. Slowly, I pulled the curtain aside and froze. The snowman was closer now, just a few feet from the house. Its crooked smile seemed wider, more sinister, and its stick arms were raised upward, as if reaching for something. The snow around its base was untouched. No footprints, no trail to show how it had moved. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. I wanted to wake my grandparents, but when I returned to the window moments later, the snowman was gone. The field outside was empty, the snow smooth and undisturbed. The next morning, I went outside to investigate, The storm had eased, and the landscape was bright and still under a clear blue sky. As I walked toward the spot where the snowman had stood, I felt a growing sense of dread. There were no signs of the snowman, no collapsed pile of snow, no scattered sticks. But near the edge of the woods, I found one of its arms, a stick half buried in the snow. Around it were faint indentations, as if something heavy had moved through the area, but the fresh snow had blurred the tracks. I didn't tell my grandparents what I'd seen. They already thought I was imagining things, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But the unease stayed with me all day, and I couldn't bring myself to go back outside. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I glanced out the window again. My stomach dropped. The snowman was back, standing in the field, closer to the house than it had been before. Its crooked grin seemed more twisted now, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I called for my grandparents, but by the time they came to look, the snowman had vanished again. The field outside was empty, the snow smooth and pristine. I cut my visit short and left the next morning, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't tell my grandparents the full story. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that snowman. Its crooked smile, its lifeless stick arms, the way it seemed to move without leaving a trace. I haven't been back to the farmhouse since, and I'm not sure I ever will. Whenever I see a snowman now, I feel a chill run down my spine. I can't help but wonder if it's still standing there, waiting for someone else to notice. Winter storms in upstate Vermont aren't unusual, especially near the holidays. Most of us here know how to handle heavy snow and fierce winds. I'd been living in a small cabin on the edge of the woods for about 4 years, far enough from the nearest town to enjoy the quiet, but close enough to make the drive manageable in bad weather. It was Christmas Eve 2021. A brutal storm had rolled in, and I closed my small woodworking shop early, sending my customers and staff home before the roads got too dangerous. By the time I returned to my cabin, the snow was falling fast, blanketing everything in a thick white sheet. After shoveling just enough to park my truck, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and cranking up the heater. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending flurries of snow swirling around the yard. I found the sound oddly comforting. With a mug of hot cocoa in hand, I settled into my old recliner, the kind that leaned a little too far back if you weren't careful. It was shaping up to be a perfect night. Just me, the storm, and a documentary on polar expeditions to pass the time. Around midnight, I was halfway through the documentary when I heard a knock at the door. I sat up, my heart skipping a beat. Visitors were rare out here, especially at this hour. My nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and with the blizzard raging, it seemed unlikely anyone would be out in this weather. Cautiously, I pulled the curtain aside to peek out the front window. The porch light barely penetrated the storm, but I could make out a fresh set of boot prints leading up to my door and then back down the steps. The edges of the prints were sharp, untouched by snow. But when I scanned the yard, I didn't see anyone, just swirling white. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Opening the door wasn't an option. The wind would blast snow straight into the house, and something about those prints unsettled me. After a minute of standing there, listening to the storm, I locked the door again and returned to my chair, trying to brush it off. An hour later, another knock came. This time, it was from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. I jumped up, grabbing the flashlight I kept by the door. My pulse quickened as I flicked off the lights inside and aimed the beam through the frosted kitchen window. Nothing. The snow outside that window was pristine, undisturbed. But I was certain the knock had been real, 3 sharp raps, as clear as day. I stayed by the window for a long time, scanning the yard with the flashlight, but all I saw was snow piling higher against the walls. Convincing myself it was just a tree branch or a trick of the storm, I turned the lights back on, locked all the windows, and went to bed. The third knock came around 3 a.m., louder this time. It was at the sliding glass door that led to the back deck. My stomach churned as I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the wind. Grabbing the flashlight again, I crept down the hallway, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The curtain over the glass door wasn't drawn, and as I approached, I could see that the deck was empty. The snow outside was untouched. No tracks, no signs of anyone having stood there. But the knock had been real. I was certain of it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The knocks continued, moving around the house. Sometimes they were soft, almost polite. Other times they were loud and demanding. They came from the front door, the side windows, and the back deck, as if someone or something was circling the cabin, testing every point of entry. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching through the snow, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there. By morning, the storm had eased, and pale sunlight filtered through the clouds. I bundled up and cautiously stepped outside. The yard was still, the snow deep and untouched in most areas. But as I walked around the house, my stomach dropped. Boot prints circled the cabin, weaving between windows and doors. Whoever had made them had walked the perimeter multiple times, stopping at every entrance, every pane of glass. The prints led to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the trees. About 200 yards in, I noticed something else. The boot prints merged with a set of snowmobile tracks, faint and partially covered by the storm's final flurries. Someone had been waiting, lurking just beyond the tree line. They'd left just before dawn, knowing the snowfall would cover their tracks. I called the local police, who arrived an hour later. They listened to my story, their faces growing more serious when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks. The older officer shook his head grimly. Whoever it was knew what they were doing, he said. This wasn't random. The younger officer added, could have been kids messing around. The older man frowned. Not in this storm. Not in the middle of nowhere. They followed the tracks briefly but found nothing conclusive. The snow had erased most of the trail. If they come back, the older officer said, call us immediately, and be careful. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those boot prints circling my house or the snowmobile waiting silently in the woods. I slept with a loaded rifle beside the bed, every light in the cabin blazing. Though the storm had passed, the unease lingered, heavy as the snow still blanketing the ground. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something worse. But every time the wind howls through the trees now, I find myself checking the locks and glancing at the rifle by the door, wondering if they'll come back.